We as a society seem to be obsessed with the number 3. Look at something basic like comedy. You have the rule of 3. A running gag is repeated 3 times in order to be considered funny. 4 is often too much and 2 is not enough. 3 is perfect. When it comes to storytelling, whether it's books or movies or video games or sometimes even music, the trilogy is everywhere. And why not? It's the perfect storytelling vehicle. It has a defined beginning, middle, and end. It's, well, structurally perfect. And the funny thing about trilogies is that they can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and by that I mean how they're done. Something like Lord of the Rings, where it's one story broken up into 3 parts. That makes sense, but then you have things like Back to the Future, where they made a movie completely self-contained, it became a hit, and they made 2 more movies that added onto that one, and it actually flows out still into one nice 3-part story together. That one's done such that I've never sat down and just watched one of those movies by themselves. I will watch the whole trilogy together. Then you have things like the way the first 3 Indiana Jones movies were, where you had your original, and then you had a prequel, and then when it was a sequel to the first one. And then you've got things like The Matrix, which kind of did the same thing as Back to the Future. So there's all these trilogies, and they all have names. Lord of the Rings trilogy. Star Wars has 3 trilogies, and they all have theirs. The original, the prequel, the sequel. You know, right now we have the Matrix trilogy, but of course they are working on a 4th one. Same with Indiana Jones was a trilogy, and then they added on to that. But there's one thing, one trilogy, that is just known as the trilogy. And you've probably never heard of it. Well, if you're a fan of the channel and you've been here for a while, I've hinted at this one before, and by hinted I mean I've talked about it. And you saw the title of the video, again you know what I'm talking about. If you were to go to Central Europe, especially Poland, but a lot of other places around there in Central and Eastern Europe, and you just mentioned the trilogy, this is what they're going to think about. The 3 books, the trilogy, of author Henryk Sienkiewicz. And that's a name you're going to have to get used to, because I've got a list of movies that I'm planning on reviewing, and probably 75% of them right now are all films based on books by Henryk Sienkiewicz. He's that influential of an author. You've actually probably heard of some of his books, if you haven't heard of these. But this is just the trilogy. In some places, the Sienkiewicz trilogy, but generally, if you tell European about the trilogy, this is what they're thinking of. And this is bold, because if you get the CD soundtrack for the 3 movies, it just says on there, trilogy. I mean, that's pretty impressive. It's not just another trilogy, it's the trilogy, and with good reason. Now you're probably asking yourself, why do I need an introduction video for these movie reviews? And well, history. Sure, they're historical fiction, and if you really want to know about this era in Polish history, you really need to look it up and read into it. It's fascinating. Even read the books, because even though they're fictional, it's a real thing that happened. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the movies of the Henryk Sienkiewicz trilogy, or just the trilogy, which is how we're going to refer to it from now on. I don't need to keep saying both. If you hear me say the trilogy, I'm talking about the Sienkiewicz trilogy. So the movies of the Sienkiewicz trilogy by director Jerzy Hoffman. And these were released from 1969 to all the way up to 1998. 3 movies in about a 30-year period. But that's not the only thing that gets amazing with this. And the books were released, as with Fire and Sword, The Deluge, and Fire in the Steepy, which would also be the film, Colonel Wojciechowski, Pan Wojciechowski. It's also been called The Adventures of Sir Michael. Here's the thing, I'm using some of the titles interchangeably. Colonel Wojciechowski just sounds too long, so I will use the more Polish title, Pan Wojciechowski. The Deluge, we'll just call The Deluge, even though that's about the same as the Polish title of Potop. And with Fire and Sword, I am totally saying it in English, because if I showed it to you written out in Polish, my Polish is getting pretty good, but we're just going to call it Fire and Sword. So here's the thing, with Fire and Sword, it's the first one, and arguably the most famous. You may have even heard of the game Mountain Blade with Fire and Sword, which is a loose adaptation of the book, meaning the character's all there, but you can pretty much do whatever you want. And The Deluge is one that you might actually be more familiar with than you think, because there's references to The Witcher 3 in it. In fact, my introduction to The Witcher came from me quoting a line from The Deluge, and a buddy of mine who had no idea about these started going off on how he loved The Witcher, and he thought it was funny how I was quoting the game, and I thought, no man, I'm quoting a movie based on a book. And then of course, Pan Wojciechowski is the 3rd and final installment. And these are all fairly self-contained stories. We'll get to that in a little bit. That's why this needs an introduction. But here's where things get interesting. So, we've discussed the order of the books, but the movies, 1969, Pan Wojciechowski is released. 74, The Deluge, and 98 with Fire and Sword. They're released backwards. I mean, even when I have them in my case here, I have them listed from right to left, in that reverse order, the order they were released in. Now, there seems to be a lot of speculation as to why these were done backwards, but the most commonly accepted reasoning for this is the Soviet government. See, with Fire and Sword, it has to do with a war between Poland and Ukraine, and Ukraine was a pretty big player during the age of Soviet Union, so they didn't want them seen as a villain. So when Jerzy Hoffman set out to make the trilogy, supposedly the Soviet government told him, "You're not making with Fire and Sword." So the rest of what I'm going to tell you is completely conjecture on my part, but let's think about this. You want to take these 3 epic books, make them into movies, but you're told you can't make the first one. Now the good news is they're all, again, fairly self-contained stories, but you've got 2 to choose from. Which do you choose? Honestly, choosing Pan Vodioski to be the first of the trilogy makes a lot of sense. And yes, you're working backwards, but it does make sense, and here's why. It's probably the most epic in scope story, at least as far as what we know as storytelling. It's the perfect example of the hero's journey. I'm sure I don't need to explain this to you. Everybody talks about the hero's journey, but it really does follow that structure, and also just the character of Michael Vodioski. He's in the other 2 books, but he's sort of a side character, a major side character, but a side character. But this last book is all about him. It's his story, and it even has this epic, heroic ending for him. Well, the movie does. The book's a little different. But I would agree with that. If I had to make one of these 2 films, because I can't make my first one into a movie, the third one makes the most sense because it does have that more self-contained story. There's a few things politically going on that actually have to follow up from the Deluge, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but the movie kind of downplays it, and I do mention that in the review. Mostly the main villain from the Deluge, or sort of the main villain from the Deluge, is in Pan Vodioski, one of the candidates to become the new king of Poland. So one of the reasons they need to get Michael Vodioski to help them is, 1, to help fight this war with the Turks, and 2, to have his vote against this old enemy. Again, they just kind of downplay that. It's briefly mentioned in the movie, but here's the thing. Most people in Poland were familiar with the stories, they're familiar with the history, they knew what was going on, and for those of us who aren't familiar, it's not considered that important as far as the movie's concerned. It's all about the war with the Ottoman Empire. And as a side note, all these have been made into movies time before. This is the definitive version. They haven't been done since, at least not that I know of. But prior to this, just in 1962, so just a few years earlier than Pan Vodioski came out, there was an Italian film that came out. It was released in the United States as Invasion 1700, and in some places it was called something like Daggers of Blood, or some stupid title like that makes no sense. And in some other places it was actually titled With Fire and Sword, because that's what it is. Invasion 1700 is an adaptation of With Fire and Sword. I've never seen this one. Eventually I should probably get around to seeing it, because like I said, it is one of my favorite books, and it is one of my favorite movies. I should probably check this one out. I know very little about it. However, the villain Bohun is played by a man named John Drew Barrymore, who is in fact the father of actress Drew Barrymore. So a little bit of cool trivia there for you as well. So the Soviet government won't let you make the first book into a movie, and the Italians already did just a few years earlier anyway. Starting at the end does make a lot of sense. Besides, if the movie doesn't do so well, you just told a really cool self-contained story. But the movie does do well. So you make a sequel, but you can't make a sequel because this was the end of the timeline. So you make a prequel. Makes sense. And the timeline for this lines up. Pan Vodioski comes out in 79, The Deluge comes out in 74, so they almost would have had to gone right into that, especially with how big and massive The Deluge is. Now, I said Pan Vodioski has a pretty epic scope as far as storytelling. The Deluge is probably the most epic film ever made. I mentioned this in my Band in Poland video, but it is about 5.5 hours long. Like, I mentioned this in the Pan Vodioski video. I say it is a very epic movie, and you can say that about all 3 of these, but that's the thing. Pan Vodioski is a good movie. It's a great movie as far as I'm concerned, but The Deluge is like the epic of epic movies. Like, there's nothing else like it. That is not a film that you just sit down and watch. You experience that movie. And that's great, but now we're done because the government won't let us make With Fire and Sword into a movie. And again, the timeline really does add up because the film With Fire and Sword comes out in 98. Given all the pre-production and all that on films, it would almost seem the reason that almost immediately as the Iron Curtain fell, Jerzy Hoffman went, I can go back and finish the trilogy. But of course, That's all just speculation on my part. Here's where we came into problems when I started working on these videos almost a year ago. What order should I do them in? Should I do them in the book order? Because chronologically there's a few things that cross over, but generally they are self-contained stories other than a few characters showing up in all three. Or should I do them in the movie order? Ultimately I decided I'm going to do these in the movie order. There are reasons why. There's ways certain actors are used interchangeably throughout all three films, or even not in each film, that makes a lot of sense from the director's standpoint. It just made perfect sense to go ahead and do this in the film order. And every time I watch these, I've watched them in the film order. So I'm getting ready to do this. I throw in Pan Wojciechowski and the disc won't play. I finally pull the disc out, look at it, and it turns out it's cracked. So now I got to find another copy of this. Now, this is a box set. This is probably the best way to go about this, is getting the box set. But now I have to find one movie from the box set. So while I'm working on that, getting on eBay and trying to find a copy of a movie I already own to go back into my box set here and not spend a lot of money, because I don't want to break the bank here, because sometimes buying foreign films like this can get expensive, I decide for the first time ever I'm going to watch these in book order. And then I would go back and rewatch them in movie order and take my notes and get everything done. As I was doing that, I got through them backwards. My copy of Pan Wojciechowski showed up. I started watching them in the book order. And here's the thing. I don't like feeling unoriginal. I'm a small channel, and I can get a lot of crap from, like, if I put out a video and somebody else put out a similar video, and then I'm seen as riding the coattails. And a YouTuber I absolutely love who does historical martial arts stuff, especially European fencing, everything, Skulligrim, as I was working on these, did a video analyzing the sword duel in The Deluge, which, by the way, for the better part of a decade now, I've been on YouTube showing people, and I'm like, this is the greatest sword fight in cinematic history. And that was part of the thing, is I was going to do a big analyzation of this myself. He did it. I don't have to, but now I don't want to put my reviews of the movies out, because I don't want people thinking I'm just, like, I saw his and that's how I came across these. It's not at all how that happens. It's a weird personal thing. I'm sure nobody, you know, it's like when you go to the gym the first time. Do you think everybody's going to be watching you? Nobody's watching you. It's kind of like that. So I actually delayed these almost a year just so I could not be seen that way. But I am going to link his video. I'm actually going to link it in this video, but I would suggest holding off to about two to 3 weeks from now when the Deluge review comes out. Watch that and then go back and watch Skulligrim's video. He's done a few of these. He's also done like the Duelist and stuff like that. So if you're into sword fighting or fencing or European martial arts or whatever you want to call it, he's like the guy to watch. I love watching his videos, and he really goes to town on this. And it was just great to see somebody other than me talking about this movie in English. That's the thing. If you look up the sword fight between the two characters on YouTube, I've seen like things like school children in Poland reenacting that fight. It's unreal how iconic that is. And again, quotes of it even show up in The Witcher 3. So you're probably more familiar with this than you thought you were. And that leads us into our connection with The Witcher, because I decided after doing these I wanted to work on the early 2000s film and television adaptation of The Witcher, and I knew it had the actor, I can't think of his name now, but the main actor from With Fire and Sword plays the main character in those, and I started watching him and saw other actors pop up in some other things, and it was just so cool seeing that and the relation to The Witcher and the works of Henryk Sienkiewicz. And then I found out something else about the video games that also pulled it all together nicely, and we'll talk about that when we get to The Witcher. But it all pulled together nicely. It's like, I have to do all this. You're looking at a 2-hour movie and then a 13-episode TV series, and then of course when we do that I need to get into the new Netflix series, and I figured I also need to at least try and play some of the video games, because I know nothing about this franchise except what I've picked up in the past few weeks. So I'm actually working on more than just this. Working on the reviews of the trilogy has brought me into another franchise which I am slowly falling in love with and can see why people love it. But I am a history buff, and I am a stickler for knowing where you came from. And again, it's a lot of stuff from The Witcher that comes from here, which is incredible. And we're going to see that. I'm sure somebody who's familiar with both this and the Witcher franchise could probably make a list of things that are similar. I can't do that. Anyway, this has gone on long enough. I've gone off on a few tangents telling you the history of the films, the books, what I've gone through making these. You've probably listened to me ramble on long enough if you're even still here. So we're going to end this now, and we're going to get right into it next time with the review of Pan Wojciechowski. And I hope you enjoy these. I hope this inspires you to pick up the movies and watch them. There is one more thing I should say. I'm sure I frightened a lot of people when I mentioned The Deluge being a almost 6-hour movie, 2 discs. I should actually point this out. Something important about this box set, actually, because With Fire and Sword is on 2 as well. The copy of With Fire and Sword that is in this box set is actually the TV version, not the theatrical early release version, which is cool because it's the extended version. So it's like 4.5 hours long, but it's divided up into like 4 episodes, which makes watching this really easy because you can just watch an episode and then go do something else and come back to it. Whereas The Deluge is done as The Deluge. It is almost a 6-hour film, and that can be daunting for some people, especially it is in Polish, it is in subtitles. When I tell people about these, I'll tell them, give them a rundown of the story, and they're like, this sounds awesome. And I'll mention, well, just so you know, it is almost a 6-hour film and it is subtitled, and almost be like, oh, I'm not doing that. I'm not reading subtitles for 6 hours. Well, would you read the book? Yeah, I'd read the book. Okay, well, how long is it going to take you to read the book? I'm a slow reader. I've read With Fire and Sword a couple times. I've listened to the audiobook on LibriVox has that, and somebody's recently been doing The Deluge as well. But I think With Fire and Sword comes in at around 33 hours for the audiobook. Now, I read slow, so we'll base it off of that, though. Even though The Deluge is a much bigger book, we'll say the average person reads it in like 40 hours. It might take me 2 to 3 times that, or I can watch the 6-hour movie and just read the subtitles for 6 hours. Now, there was a 40th anniversary version of The Deluge done a couple of years ago. That would have been, 2014, where I heard they edited it down and they took out something like 2 hours of the movie because they wanted to make it more accessible to modern audiences. I mean, they were saying it's too long for most modern people, and I'll admit, even though I love the movie, sometimes it can feel like a bit much to sit through, and I've often said, you could pretty much get out almost the first 45 minutes of the film. You wouldn't really lose much, but I also wouldn't do that because it's good character building. Well, Jerzy Hoffman did acknowledge this. They cut out almost 2 hours of a 5.5-hour movie, and from what I've heard, it doesn't change things too well. It just speeds up the pacing. So I'm not sure if that version is available with English subtitles, but it is out there and would be a way to go. But I would recommend, if you're willing to sit through it, you are in for a treat if you're willing to sit through the full film of The Deluge. The other thing is, in this box set, this copy of With Fire and Sword has a weird anomaly. I'm going to talk about this now because I don't think I'm going to mention it in the review. I've discovered this the first time I was watching it, and the first time I watched it was a few years ago, before I started learning the language, and I didn't think anything of it. There's scenes, though, where people will be talking, and you'll hear this other male voice over top of the people talking. I just thought it was maybe a movie thing, like, oh, they're probably talking in their native language, because a lot of times it would be the Ukrainian guy speaking. And so I figured maybe that's just the voice over top of it is actually, they're repeating it in Polish, which seems dumb. You'd think there'd be subtitles, but I guess that's the way to do it. But then I started learning the language, and I started listening to it, and I realized they're both the voice that's like the voiceover and the actual voice of the characters in the movie are in Polish. And I'm like, this is weird and it's distracting. And I went to Amazon to look at reviews and only found one review that mentions, nobody else mentions it, but one review is like, yeah, there's this weird second voice that's just talking over the characters randomly. And it is. The first few times it's usually the Ukrainian guys talking, but this is happening with Polish characters and a few others. And it turns out it's an anomaly known to only happen in the DVDs that have this case. There's another set. It has the original movie poster. If you want to see that, that's the version I've heard to get, because it doesn't have that weird second voiceover. So I Again, I've only found one other person talking about this, but yeah. So if you pick up the box set, that's something you have to worry about. I am going to try and get the other copy of that at some point. But if you pick them up individually, because the box set can be pretty pricey. I paid like $50 for this, and I've been trying to get hold of it for years. And that was the cheapest I could find it. And then I thought when my copy of Pan Wojciechowski broke, that I'd be in trouble. That I would have to go out of my way and spend almost just as much for this, another copy. And that wasn't the case. I paid like $5 for that. So buying them individually might actually be the way to go if you're interested in these. But for as far as with Fire and Sword goes, I would recommend staying away from this copy of it just because of that weird, distracting voice. It's like listening to two people talking at the same time in a language you might not even understand. So, and it actually was worse once I did start to understand the language. So, yeah, a lot going on, but we're going to dive into these now. So, seriously, I'm going to get out of here, and next time we'll be reviewing Jerzy Hoffman's adaptation of Henryk Sienkiewicz's Pan Wojciechowski.